The subcommittee will come to order. The witnesses will take their seats. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Today, the United States and Saudi Arabia work together on maintaining security in the Middle East. Despite the differences between the two countries, we both face the same terrorist enemies that seek our destruction in the post-9/11 era. Our counterterrorism cooperation with Saudi Arabia has increased. According to the Department of Treasury, the Kingdom has made improvements in enforcing stringent banking rules that help stem the flow of money to terrorist groups through Saudi financial institutions. Saudi Arabia is the co-chair of the Counter-ISIL Finance Group, and this group seeks to cut off ISIS from the international finance system. Saudi Arabia has launched aggressive military campaigns in Syria and Yemen, and while the Kingdom has taken important steps since 9/11 to counter terrorism, it has some room to improve. I think we must separate the individuals that live in Saudi Arabia and what they do to support financially terrorism and the government of Saudi Arabia. While the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has adopted strict laws prohibiting terrorist finance, there continue to be press reports about Saudi charities and individual donors funding ISIS, al-Qaeda, and foreign fighters. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia still spends billions of dollars every year exporting the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam through its networks of building mosques and schools throughout the world, including in the United States. Wahhabism is a fundamentalist form of Islam that insists on a literal interpretation of the Quran. Its 18th century founder, Abd al-Wahhab, in seeking to purify Islam, taught that apostates, that's Christians and Jews and some Muslims, should be persecuted and in some cases killed. So we should not be surprised that some people practice, when they are taught Wahhabism, violence. While not all followers of Wahhabism are terrorists, many argue that Wahhabi followers are more easily recruited by terrorist groups. ISIS openly follows this strict form of Islam and cites Wahhabi clerics, but it does not accept the royal Saudi family as legitimate authorities. Some of the Wahhabi ideology has been exposed in Saudi textbooks, and the U.S. has pushed Saudi Arabia to address the problem. In 2006, the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, John Hanford, told Congress the Saudi government would finish its comprehensive revision of textbooks by 2008. Here we are 8 years later, and the process is still in the future. Where is the new book? As of 2014, high school textbooks worldwide contained offensive materials about Jews, Christians, and others. For example, a 12th grade textbook professes that treachery, betrayal, and the denunciation of covenants are among the attributes of the Jews. Another 12th grade textbook asserts that the punishment for conversion away from Islam is execution. This is somewhat disturbing, and the Saudi Arabian government needs to be more aggressive in revising these textbooks if that is the goal. The same can be said about sermons given by Saudi clerics at mosques behind closed doors. Researchers have cited hateful messages by clerics that are tantamount to incitement. Then, of course, there is the issue that has been brought up again regarding counterterrorism prior to 9/11. 9/11 Commission reports note that Saudi Arabia was long considered the primary source of al-Qaeda funding. There's speculation about the extent of the Saudi government officials in providing help to 9/11 hijackers. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. Then there's the issue of the 28 missing pages in the 9/11 report. I have read the 28 missing pages that the public does not have access to, and I think the public should have access and be able to see those 28 pages. It is my understanding that the Saudi Arabian government also wants those 28 pages declassified. I think we must make a distinction to some extent between post-9/11 and events that occurred after before 9/11. If a foreign country, any country, can be shown to have significantly supported a terrorist attack on the United States, The victims and their families ought to be able to sue that foreign country no matter who it is. Like any other issue, we should let a jury decide that issue and the damages, if any. As a former judge, I'm a great advocate in having litigation in our courts of law to get justice. If our policy is between American victims and also victims from other parts of the world regarding 9/11 versus our priorities with dealing with foreign countries, I think our government should always come down on the side of victims and their families of 9/11, without exception. There are issues dealing with foreign countries, but the 9/11 victims, their families, certainly need justice to occur. Some say that this occurred a long time ago, and it's time to move on with our relationships with foreign countries. 15 years ago, waiting for justice to occur is too long under our system. If, in fact, some other government may have been involved in the 9/11 attacks. I'm not saying they were or they weren't, but part of this hearing is to explore this issue as well. The United States' national security interest does include working with Saudi Arabia, but the national security interest of the United States also must include making sure that the victims of 9/11 have all of the facts of what occurred on that day that none of us will forget. I'll yield to the ranking member from Massachusetts for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, for conducting this hearing, and I'd also like to thank our panel of witnesses who bring with them years of experience and knowledge on the topic of today, Saudi Arabia. For decades, the United States has maintained strong bilateral relations with the kingdom, anchored by U.S.-Saudi security cooperation and U.S. concern for global availability of Saudi energy. We've engaged the Saudi government as a strategic partner to promote regional security and global economic stability. However, our relationship is deeper than just shared security challenges. It's in both of our countries' interest to strengthen these relationships, yet for us to be mindful that over the last few years, shifts in political and economic landscape of the region have shed light on the kingdom's domestic policies. Issues such as political reform, education, human rights, and religious freedom are now more prominent in the U.S.-Saudi relationship than it was in years past. There's no doubt these sensitive issues have contributed to growing challenges between Washington and Riyadh. In April, President Obama met with Saudi officials while the visit allayed concerns like making sure our shared security interests remain strong. Still, gaps in the fence remain. Further complicating the relationship is America's increasing energy independence and the recent shale oil boom that's produced our imports, increased imports and increased our exports when it comes to oil. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members rely on American markets to refine their systems and bring to the market heavy sour crude oil. As we continue to witness the evolution of this region through the lens of the administration's final year, it's important that we consider our own objectives. It's the responsibility of the United States to keep our foreign policy objectives close in mind as we assess our bilateral relations with partners and whether they promote or hinder these goals. A particular concern to me is the credibility of our shared counterterrorism operations and intentions. While our two countries have worked successfully to address counterterrorism threats and the financing of those threats through intelligence sharing and monitoring compliance, other actions may complicate these efforts. For example, Riyadh's campaign in Yemen has changed our efforts to combat al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and domestic counterterrorism efforts have directly targeted human rights activists and peaceful protesters who have been tried in Saudi in terrorism tribunals. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses regarding the future of the United States and Saudi in terms of their relationships and how we can work together to align mutual goals and promote a more open society. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the ranking member. Chair will now recognize other members for a 1-minute opening statement. Chair recognizes Mr. Issa from California for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing today. There are two committees that will be looking at the proposal that's come from the Senate, this committee and Judiciary. Judiciary Committee has to look, quite frankly, at U.S. law and whether litigation against the sovereign nation is appropriate. We as a committee have to look at the world. We have to look at the bigger question. What if we do this without an affirmative, specific foreknowledge of wrongdoing by a representative at a high level of the Saudi government? The answer is clear. If we look at it and allow discovery, a poking around, a typical plaintiff's trial lawyer look-see, then in fact the rest of the world will likely respond. If the rest of the world likely responds, there is no question but that actions of U.S. persons or U.S. entities, including but not limited to our intelligence community, will have us in courts around the world. It is our responsibility, both here at this committee and when looking at highly classified documents, to reach a conclusion of whether or not this case should be allowed to go forward before allowing discovery outside of the U.S. government. I thank the Chairman for his yielding and yield back.
Thank the gentleman from California. Chair recognizes another gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for an opening statement.
Our laws already provide an exception to sovereign immunity for those who are state sponsors of terrorism. It seems only a slight increase in that to say it should apply if the plaintiffs are able to show that the foreign government engaged in terrorism here in the United States. But as important as it is to have our judicial system work for the benefit of victims, it may be that it is up to the United States to compensate the victims, as we have to some degree. And the most important thing is not punishing those who committed this or supported this act, but preventing the next act of terrorism. What concerns me is the Saudi government comes to us and says they're our friend and we should protect them from this statute, while funding every day the Wahhabi mullahs, who not only preach orthodox practice of Islam, but preach violent murder against those who they disagree with. And it is time for Saudi Arabia to come clean. They can't say they don't support terrorism. All they do is fund at the hundreds of millions of dollars a year those who plant the seeds of terrorism around the world. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing on the critical relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. For over 70 years, both countries have had a close economic partnership, beginning with the establishment of the Arab American Oil Company, Aramco, by the Standard Oil Company in 1944. In recent decades, Saudi Arabia has made substantial progress in their counterterrorism efforts post 9/11. They have strengthened financial policies aimed at countering terrorist financing and worked with the United States and other countries to increase transparency and information sharing. They've also imposed harsh sentences on Saudi nationals who attempt to join foreign terror groups and have conducted military operations against the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations in the region. These are all important steps in working toward peace and security for the region. As we work together to combat Islamic extremism, we must keep in mind the considerable influence that Saudi Arabia has over the ideologies and religious practices that will guide the Middle East for years to come. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on the future of U.S.-Saudi Arabia terrorism relationship. Again, I appreciate the leadership of our Chairman, Judge Ted Poe. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. It's a long overdue. How many Americans have to die? How many of our innocent citizens are blown up or murdered from a terrorist act that we are ignoring, intentionally ignoring who's financing those acts? I think it's clear to all of us who've been active in Washington over the years that the Saudis and the Saudi royal family have been right up to their eyeballs in terrorist activity and supporting the terrorist activity of radical Islamic forces in the Middle East. It's up to us to call the truth, to say the truth. We're not going to correct the situation. It won't get better unless we're willing to step up and basically let the American people know who's the bad guy and who's the good guy in this age of terrorism.
Thank the gentleman. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record subject to the length limitation in the rules. And without objection, all witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. I ask that each witness keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes. I'll introduce each witness. I do want to thank you, all 4 of you, for being here early, on time, before we ever started, supposed to start this hearing. But as you all know, votes got in the way, so I do appreciate your patience. Ambassador Tim Romer is a former member of Congress and a former U.S. ambassador to India. While he was in Congress, he sat on the House Intelligence Committee and was a member of the 9/11 Commission. Mr. Simon Henderson is the Baker Fellow and Director of the Gulf Energy Policy Program at Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He has written 2 studies of the Saudi royal family, both of which were published by the Washington Institute. And Mrs. Karen Elliott House is currently a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She is the past, or she is not the past author, she is the author of the book on Saudi Arabia, its people, past, religion, fault lines, and future. And Dr. Daniel Byman is a professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He's served on the 9/11 Commission staff and has testified numerous times before this committee. Ambassador Romer, we will start with you. You have 5 minutes.
Very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member Keating, fellow members. I ask unanimous consent the entirety of my statement be entered into the record, and I would recognize a special guest I have here today, my son Matthew Romer, who just graduated from Wake Forest University.
Without exception.
Thank you, Mr.
Your comments will be made part of the record, and we do recognize your son, who's a recent graduate of Wake Forest.
Thank you, sir. Throughout the history of our engagement with the kingdom, our relationship with Saudi Arabia has been strategically crucial, yet a challenging one, and at times a very demanding one. Saudi Arabia sits at the crossroads of so many critical issues for American foreign policy interests: terrorism, Iran, Middle East stability, energy, and human rights. Serving on the 9/11 Commission, we noted that the U.S.-Saudi relationship had been in the dark for too long. Both countries' governments recognized the value in working closely together, but neither was willing to make the case for the relationship in public, to argue for its merits and its shortcomings. The 9/11 Commission recommended over 10 years ago, quote, "The problems in the U.S.-Saudi relationship must be confronted openly. It should include a shared interest in greater tolerance and cultural respect, translating into a commitment to fight the violent extremists who foment hatred," unquote. 10 years ago, we said that. Today, we still struggle to talk directly about our relationship with the kingdom. In light of this fact, I would like to thank this committee for holding this hearing on this subject, bringing greater transparency and clarity to American diplomacy and to the American people. The Saudis pose a number of challenges for the United States and its foreign policy. Saudi society still continues to produce a disturbing number of recruits and supporters for terrorist groups around the world, including in Syria. Moreover, according to a front-page article in the New York Times just this past Sunday, titled "How Kosovo Has Turned into a Fertile Ground for ISIS," Saudi influence and money has transformed this once tolerant Muslim society into a, quote, "font of Islamic extremism and pipeline for jihadists," unquote. Domestically, the Saudi government still continues to have a poor record on human rights. The Saudis are fighting a war in Yemen with goals different than the United States, thus creating some problems for the United States in the Middle East. These are signs, ladies and gentlemen, that the United States and Saudi Arabia still have much work to do in this crucial partnership, and it is a partnership. I believe that our relationship with the kingdom is crucial to our interests in the Middle East. Addressing our concerns diplomatically and privately is often the appropriate path. As a former diplomat, we often did this behind closed doors. However, sometimes we must honestly and openly confront our legitimate differences. Friends and allies cannot bury their disagreements. They must frankly address them, and counterterrorism must be at the top of the American and the Saudi list. Counterterrorism. After 9/11, the news that 15 of the 19 hijackers had come from Saudi Arabia led many Americans to question whether the Saudis were the ally we thought them to be. They continue to be our ally, but an embattled one. Furthermore, we found that Saudi Arabia was fertile ground for fundraising and support for al-Qaeda. In the 9/11 Commission report, we did not discover high-level and direct Saudi government involvement in the plot, but wrote that Saudi Arabia had been a problematic ally in the fight against terrorism. There is a glaring contrast some days and weeks and months between high-level Saudi legitimate cooperation in helping the United States uncover plots, which is critical for us, but it often directly conflicts with a society and culture that sometimes exports extremism and intolerance. There has been recent media attention to these 28 pages that Judge Poe just cited, classified information actually written by Congress in the Joint Intelligence Committee, but was reviewed and investigated by the 9/11 Commission. I served on both of these panels. I am strongly in favor for declassifying this information as quickly and as soon as possible. For national security reasons, the 9/11 families deserve it, the American people deserve it, and justice deserves it. We have the right as Americans to transparency and sunlight, not the darkness that conspiracy theories thrive on in today's cynical political climate. While the 28 pages are important to declassify, we need to get those out, it is crucial to understand the unclassified 9/11 Commission report, particularly chapters 5, 7, and the footnotes, where we talk about some of the problems that are ongoing today in Saudi society to export extremism, fund radical ideology for terrorist groups, and supply a stream of jihadists around the world. We have seen, no doubt, improvements from the kingdom. It has created a de-radicalization program and is helping to reintegrate extremists back into society in a regular fashion. Saudi intelligence agencies have worked very closely with their American counterparts to share information about threats from extremist groups, most notably a tip-off in 2010, which reportedly led to the disruption of a plot to bomb U.S. cargo planes. They also briefly participated in the U.S. war led against the Islamic State coalition in Syria. According to the most recent State Department country reports on terrorism, the Saudis have instituted a number of legal reforms to strengthen the prohibitions on supporting terrorism. These are crucial tools in fighting terrorism, but sometimes they're not sufficient strategic ones. Saudi Arabia has outlawed terrorist groups like the Islamic State and banned its citizens from providing financial support to them. Yet, despite these official acts, studies on the background of Islamic State foreign fighters continue to show that Saudi recruits are among the most numerous among the group's ranks. A recent West Point study confirmed that Saudi recruits were in the highest three groups in Syria. The threat of extremism cannot be countered by police, intelligence, and military actions alone. The Saudi government needs to address the threat of radicalization and extremism within its own society. In all of this, we should be cognizant of the fact that the Saudis themselves are threatened by extremism and have suffered greatly from it. In 2003, Saudi al-Qaeda terrorists unleashed a campaign of attacks in that country that shocked the kingdom. The Saudis took immediate steps to address this. I want to speak for a moment, Mr. Chairman, about Iran. Iran's support for terrorism is a serious threat to Middle East stability, American interests, and American allies in the region. In the face of these threats, we must make sure that Saudi Arabia, the focus of so much of Iran's attention and ambitions, is able to resist and appropriately confront Tehran's attempts to influence the region. How we manage this makes vital difference to our friends and allies in the Middle East. We cannot allow Saudi Arabia's justified fears of its neighbor to lead to deeper disagreements within and with the United States. While we work together to counter some of Iran's nefarious efforts to stoke instability in the region, this must not distract from the fight against terrorist threats like al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Mr. Chairman, I will skip through some comments on energy. I want to conclude on a human rights topic. Congress helped create the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom in 1998 in order to promote the fundamental human rights of people to worship and observe their faith in peace. Since its creation, the Commission, at the urging, I might add, of Congress, has done valuable work uncovering examples of intolerance, anti-Semitism, and incitement to violence in Saudi textbooks provided to schools in developing countries all over the world. The Islamic State has even discovered and utilized this material in some of their textbooks to reflect their worldview. One scholar has even noted that the use of this material in schools under the Islamic State's control in Raqqa, Syria. While the kingdom has made some progress in revising its textbooks and curtailing extremist material, and we note that and encourage that, this commission notes that the Saudi government still includes highly offensive references in their high school textbooks. So to conclude, members of this important subcommittee, having served in both the legislative and the executive branches of American government, I've seen the important role that congressional oversight and your counsel plays in shaping American foreign policy. The U.S.-Saudi relationship is an area where Congress must continue to play an important role with the executive branch and for the American people. Congress should continue to hold oversight hearings, insist on better progress on counterterrorism results from Saudi Arabia, and discuss the human rights situation. The U.S. Intelligence Committee gives credits to Saudi Arabia for developing and cooperating on counterintelligence and helping stop specific attacks. We are grateful for this. While this is true, we must see more consistent results from Saudi Arabia on preventing the export of intolerance and extremism around the world. We must work together to curtail the financial support for al-Qaeda and terrorist groups. We must see more results on reducing the Saudi supply of the high number of foreign fighters in Syria. Resetting and rebuilding this decades-long strategic partnership with Saudi will be a foreign policy priority for the United States in 2017. And I thank the chairman, my ranking member, and members for my testimony.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Henderson.
Thank you. Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, distinguished members of the committee, it is an honor and privilege to appear before you today. I have written about Saudi Arabia, particularly the royal family known as the House of Saud, for more than 20 years. Arguably, I publish more about Saudi Arabia, 10 analyses so far this year, than anyone else. I also have a reputation for detailed reporting, which probably explains why I have never been to Saudi Arabia. I've never been given a visa to visit there, although I have traveled widely in the rest of the Middle East. Saudi Arabia sees itself as the leader of the Islamic world, a leader, if not the leader, of the Arab world, and by virtue of it being the world's largest oil exporter, a leader of the energy world. Of these leadership roles, it is the Islamic one, which is, from a Saudi perspective, by far the most important. Within the kingdom are Islam's two holiest places, Mecca and Medina. Ensuring the safety of Muslim pilgrims, who thereby recognize Saudi leadership, is a paramount concern. This emphasis on Islam was a feature of a memorable memo written by a departing British ambassador 32 years ago. He identified three principal features of the kingdom. Islam was one of them. Insularity was another. It is a very closed society, or was at that point. And he also noted that the kingdom was incompetent, a feature which I often ask friends who have visited the kingdom whether it is still valid or not, and they suggest that it is. And that is a word which perhaps partly explains our concern about Saudi counterterrorism efforts. Apart from Islam, a major influence on Saudi thinking is history, particularly recent history. I would argue that the two most important events in Saudi minds both date back to 1979. In February of that year, the Islamic Revolution in Iran overthrew the Shah and brought to power a clerical regime of Shiite Muslims, the majority faith in Iran. As Shiites, they are historical rivals of Sunni Muslims, such as Saudis. The ethnic difference of Iranians mostly being Persians rather than Arabs is also significant. Later the same year, in November 1979, the Grand Mosque in Mecca was seized by Saudi militants contesting the legitimacy of the House of Saud. It was 2 weeks before Saudi soldiers, with the embarrassingly necessary assistance of French special forces, regained control. Since then, the House of Saud has had to fight on two contradictory fronts: countering regional Iranian mischief, including support for the kingdom's own minority Shiite community, while also dealing with Sunni extremists, including potential jihadists at home. The principal challenge for the US-Saudi counterterrorism relationship is that right now there is more than the usual amount of differences on emphasis and direction which can apply to even close allies. It has to be significant that in the recent profile of President Obama in the Atlantic, Saudi Arabia was criticized more severely and more often than any other country, ally or not. A new and challenging dimension in the relationship was introduced a year ago when King Abdullah died and was replaced by King Salman. 3 months after that, the line of succession changed. The Crown Prince was sacked, and he was replaced by the Deputy Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Naif, and more significantly, the number 3 slot of the Deputy Crown Prince was taken by King Salman's younger son, Mohammed bin Salman, who is just 30 years old. At the moment, we are facing an uncertain future. Washington's principal partner on counterterrorism issues for the last decade or so, Mohammed bin Naif, has been marginalized, but the need for an effective counterterrorism partnership is as great as ever. Also, Riyadh is distrustful of Washington's approach to what the Saudis sees as at least half the terrorism problem, Iran. In these circumstances, the United States cannot take for granted its current counterterrorism partnership with Saudi Arabia. Despite differences and public insults, the relationship needs to adapt so the substance of it can be sustained during the continuing period of political uncertainty, and especially within the House of Saud and where the real power lies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Ms. House? Microphone.
Oh, excuse me. I'm saying in my best Texas accent, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member, Mr.
And I can understand you a whole lot better than I can Mr. Henderson, that's
Yeah.
for sure.
I knew you wouldn't need a translator for me. The others may. I'm going to focus on Saudi Arabia itself because much is changing in the kingdom these days. A new generation of young Saudi leaders is now in charge after nearly 6 decades of rule by aged and increasingly infirm sons of the founder. Also changing, unfortunately, is the U.S.-Saudi relationship, which was built on the tacit understanding of Saudi oil for U.S. support and protection. On my latest visit there in January, the most recent of dozens of visits over the last 38 years, I began going as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I found Saudi royals and a lot of Saudi citizens. The number one question they wanted to ask is the U.S. policy of avoiding involvement in Middle East problems permanent, or will a new administration, a new U.S. president, again exert traditional leadership in the Middle East, including support for our Saudi ally? Obviously, with the presidential elections some months away, we don't know what the next administration's policy would be, but the point I want to make is I believe it is clear already that the future of Saudi Arabia with this new generation of leaders, for some of the reasons Simon mentioned, with this new generation of leaders in charge, is of critical importance to us. Despite the fact that the U.S. produces more oil than any time in 30 years, we are still dependent on the global oil market, even though only 8% of our oil comes from Saudi Arabia. And secondly, obviously has been mentioned by the chairman and others, Saudi Arabia is the wellspring of this religious Wahhabi philosophy that motivates at least some of the jihadi hatred that seeks to destroy the Western way of life. So for those reasons, I think it's critically important that U.S. policymakers understand the forces at work in the kingdom. Support for Saudi stability and Israeli democracy have been two of the key U.S. Goals in the Middle East, certainly in my whole lifetime, and in my view, they must remain so. The new generation of leadership in Riyadh has a vision, I stress the word vision, to transform the Saudi economy and to some extent its society that will benefit, in my view, not only Saudi citizens, but also potentially strengthen U.S.-Saudi relations if we are wise enough to seize that opportunity. It is not U.S. influence that has encouraged these changes, in my view, but we should welcome and support them. The new leadership, as Simon said, includes Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, the individual in charge of combating terrorism, and I can assure you that Saudis, too, focus on the need to retain Mohammed bin Nayef as the man that, in their view, has protected them from terrorism. there's not much concern about IS in Saudi Arabia, and the reason is Mohammed bin Nayef. From everything I hear, cooperation with the U.S. on anti-terrorism is deemed to be good, both on our side and theirs, where he's concerned. And to the extent that rich Saudis give money, as do other rich people in the Persian Gulf, to help finance terrorism, this does not, in my view, constitute official Saudi policy, but rather evades it. They understand, whatever the case on 9/11, they understand now that terrorism is a threat to them too. The new Deputy Crown Prince that Simon mentioned, and the significance of both of these young men is that they are grandsons of the founder. So one is 55 and the Deputy Crown Prince is only 30. He is responsible for the country's defense, its economy, and Aramco. Literally not since his grandfather, Ibn Saud, has a 30-year-old prince had the amount of power that he has. Last month, he laid out what I think is a quite remarkable vision to sharply reduce dependence on oil, to create jobs for the 70% of the Saudi population that's under 30 years of age, and many of them unemployed, to open opportunities for, as he put it, all Saudis, which is a code word for including women. And he even, on the record, came out for, quote, more moderate brand of Islam. I stress this is a vision and not a plan, but having met with him myself in January in Riyadh, I do think he is serious, and I'm happy to answer questions about that if you have any.
Sum up your remarks, if you would, Ms. House.
Pardon. So I will skip Iran. I do not believe the Saudis are entirely paranoid when they look at what Iran is doing in the region, which is antithetical to their interest, and I would argue to ours too. So I will close by just saying it's not too late for a new U.S. administration to improve the relationship with Saudi Arabia, but it will require being honest about the fact that we don't have the same values, stressing a point the ambassador made. And we do have a common strategic interest, and that is a stable Persian Gulf that is free of any other hegemonic domination. And in my view, we should seize this opportunity to support economic reform in Saudi Arabia and to rebuild trust with the Saudis by being honest about the difference, because instability in Saudi Arabia, in a Middle East that's already completely unstable, is in no one's interest. Thank you.
Dr. Byman.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, members of this distinguished subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you again and testify today. Saudi Arabia has made considerable progress on counterterrorism in the last 15 years, but it still has a long way to go. Before the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, and really until al-Qaeda began to attack the kingdom directly in May 2003, Saudi Arabia was often uncooperative on counterterrorism. The Khobar Towers investigation often encountered significant problems working with the Saudi government. Al-Qaeda-linked individuals were often not investigated, or at least those investigations were not shared with U.S. officials. And more broadly, individuals in Saudi Arabia, some of them linked to the government, supported an array of causes linked to Kashmir, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, causes on which al-Qaeda also drew. Since 2003, as others have said, there's been a tremendous change. Al-Qaeda brought the war home to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia responded very strongly, to the point where the 9/11 Commission declared in 2004 that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is now locked in mortal combat with al-Qaeda. We've seen an aggressive effort to disrupt cells, and also some progress on terrorism financing. We've seen intelligence sharing and significant penetrations. Saudi Arabia has served as a drone base for operations in Yemen, and this is invaluable. The Islamic State, like al-Qaeda, is considered a top security threat by the Saudi regime. The Islamic State itself has declared Saudi Arabia to be an enemy, and its propaganda shows a black flag flying above Mecca. Islamic State terrorists have attacked mosques of Shia Muslims in the kingdom and also Saudi security officials. And the Saudi government has arrested over 1,000 suspected Islamic State supporters, foiled several attacks, and is trying to take effort to stop people from traveling to fight. Complicating this picture, however, is that support for terrorism in Saudi Arabia is often difficult to distinguish between the government, important organizations within society, and individuals acting against the will of the government. The Saudi regime's legitimacy is tied directly to the clerical establishment, and since really the 1970s, perhaps before, has been deeply engaged in supporting an array of Islamic causes around the world. It spent tens of billions of dollars on this, and as Ambassador Rayburn mentioned, the article in the New York Times on Bosnia is almost a classic example of the sort of support we see, where Saudi government was supporting an array of mosques and other institutions that fostered extremist teachings. At times, the regime has supported these institutions. At times, it's deliberately ignored them. At other times, it's cracked down. So there has not been a single consistent response. And because these figures are often important for regime legitimacy, it's politically very difficult for them to do so. We still see support for a number of radical groups around the world. I would single out Pakistan in particular as a place where this is still commonplace. The campaign in Yemen against the Houthis there has indirectly aided al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula by giving them free space in which to operate. Now, the good news is senior Saudi preachers working with the government have urged individuals not to go to terrorist groups, not to fight in Iraq and Syria. But as has been mentioned, we see many preachers, many religious institutions condemning other Muslims in particular, also being very critical of non-Muslims, and at times quite anti-American. And much of this, in the United States at least, would be free speech, right? It's not speech I like, but it would be free speech. But nevertheless, it creates a fertile soil around the world of indoctrination, and it plays directly into the narrative that the Islamic State pushes, that it is defending true Islam against a host of enemies, including many within the Muslim world. I will conclude simply by saying that the United States has very deep differences with Saudi Arabia. These involve, for example, women's rights, homosexuality, religious freedom, freedom of speech. These are deep and fundamental differences. At the same time, Saudi Arabia is a vital partner on counterterrorism. And one of the difficulties in any policy is walking this line between a vital partner, yet one who is more partner than friend. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank all of our witnesses for their testimony. I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. I will make this comment. It's obvious that Saudi Arabia acts in its own interest. Not necessarily that's a bad thing, but countries should act in their own best interest, including the United States. We should act in our best interest. Regarding the 9/11 Commission report, the 28 classified pages, I'd like each of you just to give me a yes or no on this. Should those 28 pages be declassified in your opinion? Ambassador, you've already said.
I'm strongly in favor of declassifying the 28 pages as soon as possible, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Henderson.
Since you limit me to a yes or no answer, the answer is yes.
Thank you. Ms. House.
As a journalist, my answer is obviously yes.
And Dr. Byman.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
As mentioned in your testimony, and many members have talked about JASTA, the Senate unanimously passing legislation last week. The bill it doesn't mention any governments, but it says that the bill makes a foreign government that provides tangible support to terrorists who carry out an attack in the United States subject to the jurisdiction of American courts. Do you think that's a good idea, Ambassador?
Mr. Chairman, I would put my former congressman hat on, but also try to talk a little bit about my hat as a former diplomat. I am also strongly in favor of the Senate bill. I think it is a bipartisan bill where Senator Cornyn, who you know well, and Senator Lindsey Graham have both put in their considerations and narrowed the scope of the bill so that it does not stretch across the world and create problems on sovereign immunity for other diplomatic situations. It's narrowed to this particular issue with Saudi Arabia. And Mr. Chairman, I would then say that given that we are a country of rules and laws, and that if our court thereby finds that there was some activity or action by Saudi that contributed, let our courts prevail and let justice prevail.
All right,
We
thank
should
you,
pass this
Ambassador.
bill.
Mr. Henderson?
I agree that our courts should be allowed to prevail, with the caveat of be careful what you wish for. And taking such action could lead to Saudi retaliation, whether it be withdrawing treasury bills or actions against Americans in the kingdom. I don't think that is what we're looking for.
Ms. House, what do you think? Should we pass it or not? It's our decision that's going to
This
come up
is-
next week. The
this is-
Senate did it. What do you think?
This is beyond my expertise, but as someone who travels abroad a lot and in Saudi Arabia, a very closed and conservative society, I worry about what Simon just said, be careful, and what Congressman Issa raised earlier, the risk of retaliation. I mean, I believe vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I shall repay, that perhaps there is something to be said for letting the Saudis, letting the Lord handle that part of the vengeance on the Saudis.
All right, Dr. Byman, can you narrow it down to a yes or no?
I'll say a caveat yes, sir.
We don't get to caveat vote. It's a yay or a nay without an explanation. What is your opinion of the bill?
My opinion of the bill is that as long as the bar is very high for what constitutes state support, then it is appropriate for the courts to decide this.
A couple other observations. This hearing, y'all have talked about a lot of things, including Iran. And the Saudis have a two-front war, apparently, or two-front concern in the Middle East. It's terrorism, and it's also Iran. And I think it was Mr. Henderson who testified that our concern really is terrorism and not so much Iran. The crimes in Syria have caused millions of folks to move into Europe. Has the Saudi Arabian government ever taken any Syrian refugees into Saudi Arabia?
My understanding is that Saudi Arabia, along with the other Gulf states, has not taken refugees in a manner that we would recognize that Europe is taking refugees. I believe that at least some of the Gulf states, I'm not sure if it applies to Saudi Arabia, have been generous in allowing Syrians who already live in their countries to bring in relatives and family members at this time.
All right, thank you. I think it's somewhat interesting that Saudi Arabia does not take Syrian refugees, which is a whole different issue. I'm going to yield to the ranking member from Massachusetts for his questions. Mr. Keaton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to see if you could comment on this. As Ambassador Romer and Dr. Byman had mentioned, there's been an increases in legal reforms and efforts to really constrain financially the ability of people in Saudi Arabia to fund for this extremist activity. Now, how successful has that been? And if it hasn't been as successful as it should be, then why not? Is it a lack of will? Are they encountering difficulties just implementing this? If you could comment on that, because I think it's a fundamental question of transparency. They're doing this, they're attempting to do it. How effective have they been?
I would say, Mr. Keating, I hate to sound like Harry Truman, who talked about economists on the one hand and the other hand, but on the one hand, you see the Saudis cooperating, helping us, cracking down on terrorism, passing national laws to try to restrict people from joining up with the Islamic State. And on the other hand, as we read in the recent article in the New York Times, Saudi money and government financing for more jihadis going from Kosovo to Syria. We need both the Saudi hands working together with the United States on counterterrorism as a principal concern, along with our other strategic objectives, which are Middle East stability, which are making sure that Iran cannot do us harm through terrorism, through promoting human rights, and through some of the other key issues that we've mentioned here. I would also say, Mr. Keating, that our relationship with the Saudis, while it is difficult right now on this particular issue, we've had difficulties with them, and they've had difficulties with us before. They were not in support of the U.S. invading Iraq in 2003. They were not in favor of the U.S. Negotiating President Obama's nuclear deal and kicked back vociferously about that. They were not, for Harry Truman recognizing Israel so quickly. So we can get through this, but I'm glad that counterterrorism is front and center today.
Dr. Byman, just quickly, has it been effective? And if not, why?
It's been somewhat effective. We've seen groups in Chechnya run out of money because of a decrease in Saudi support. The Islamic State advised its supporters in the kingdom to channel money through Kuwait because the efforts in the kingdom were extensive enough to be disruptive. But a number of causes still enjoy considerable domestic legitimacy. Again, I mentioned Pakistan, and as a result, you can give to groups that are kind of one level out from the most radical, but the individuals involved often cross over. Part of it is simply technically very hard, but I think part of a problem is a deep political will issue to go after the entirety of the problem.
Just quickly, I think the panel's done a great job covering, as time permits, a wide array. But I want to ask you this question, if you could just answer it briefly because of time. Where do you see Saudi Arabia 10 years from now, particularly in terms of the U.S.?
Saudi Arabia in 10 years' time will, I think, be very much recognizable as the Saudi Arabia of today. I don't anticipate any revolution, any emerging republic to replace the royal family. What I don't know is who will be king of Saudi Arabia then, when the transition will occur, and under what circumstances it will occur. This is very different from the way our knowledge of Saudi Arabia looking backwards over the last 30 or 40 years, where there was a predictability to the whole thing. With the eminence, the increasing prominence of the 30-year-old Mohammed bin Salman, previous conceptions about how Saudi Arabia is going to move forward have had to be discarded. So
it's less predictable. Does anyone else quickly want to venture any vision?
It is definitely less predictable, but I think it is likely not to be dramatically different. But in my view, it will have inched forward some. Women are, I know nobody likes to hear this, but they are much better educated than the men, and they're much more willing to work, and they are managing to get opportunities. And the Saudi people, while unhappy with various things at home, look around at the total chaos and bloodshed in the rest of the Middle East, and whatever they think of the Saudi royal family now, they prize stability over change.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Wilson, South Carolina.
Thank you, Judge Poe. And Ms. House, Saudi Arabia has incredible influence in the Islamic world. With the status of reforms to the Saudi educational curriculum promised in 2008, has that been produced or not?
No, I don't think so, because as the man who was in charge of changing the textbooks told me when I was writing my book, at some level, it doesn't matter what the textbooks say. When you close the door, the teacher is in charge, and all too many of the teachers are in total agreement with the more rigid Wahhabi philosophy that has been ingrained.
And it seems illogical to me, the promotion of jihadism would create such a level of instability that would threaten the regime in Riyadh. Is that not correct?
No, they have been very successful, as I said. Mohammed bin Nayef, the crown prince, they have been very successful at controlling terrorism in the kingdom since the 2003, 4, 5 period when they had a lot of it. And people want that stability, and if repression occurs against some human rights advocates in the context of that, most Saudis are sadly willing to overlook that. As Dr. Bynum said, what we would call free speech, they punish.
And it just it seems, again, counterproductive, but hope springs eternal.
Counterproductive to do what?
To the existence of the kingdom, that there would be such a extremist ideology that
As he said, it is fundamentally what gives the royal family their legitimacy, is that we support the Wahhabis who are propagating the one true Islam, and they prefer that it be exported, as they're doing in other places, and they control themselves, the jihadis at home.
Well, I just see the instability, whether it be Yemen or you name it, or Pakistan or Libya, wherever, that Kosovo. But bottom line, thank goodness we have good people like Ambassador Romer around. And Ambassador, I'm really grateful from the state of South Carolina, the late Governor John C. West served as ambassador to Saudi Arabia and worked very closely to establish warm bipartisan relationship. Can you judge the effectiveness of Saudi Arabia's attempt to fight terrorism financing? Have we seen a noticeable impact on their financing of groups in the region?
Congressman Wilson, thank you for the question. I would say that it is inconsistent on financial crackdowns and financial progress. We've probably seen since 2003 more progress from the Saudis than at any other time once they had the eternal attacks and took this quite seriously. But I think, as Dan Byman said, we often see this supported, ignored, and then a crackdown, and supported, ignored, and a crackdown, and not consistent enough. The financial area is somewhere where I think the United States and the Treasury Department has been very successful at working with the Saudi government in some areas, but I don't think it's consistent enough, and I don't think it's passed through from the top levels of Saudi society down into the cultural and religious areas.
Well, thank goodness again that you're involved, and we need your guidance. And Mr. Byman, how would you characterize the Saudi counterterrorism campaign in Yemen? Has it been effective?
Sir, for the most part, the campaign has not been effective. They've gone into Yemen primarily to fight the Houthi movement there, which they believe is tied to Iran. In my view, the ties are real, but the Saudis overstate them considerably. But the Middle East, sir, as you know, is a mess. And what makes it more confusing is the Houthis are fighting al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So by fighting the group the Saudis believe is tied to Iran, they've given the al-Qaeda group more freedom of operation. Recently, they've been trying to fight both, but that said, the big winner of the Saudi intervention has been al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula.
Well, again, thank each of you for, as you say, a very complicated situation. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Okay, let me just quiz you all by a show of hands. How many of you believe that the House of Saud will be in control of Saudi Arabia 15 years from now, a monarchy under the House of Saud. If you think so, raise your hand.
15.
15 years. Okay, we've got 4 hands raised. That's better odds than many governments in the Middle East get.
People are passive.
Second, the Saudis have said they'd sell $750 billion of assets if we pass this law. I don't think they'd do it, but even when they say they would do it, is this to avoid attachment as a litigation defense strategy, or is this to punish and scare the United States? Why are they claiming to do the 750, Ambassador?
Congressman, I don't think they'd do it. They didn't buy those securities and American bonds to do us a charitable work. They did it to make money. They're not going to sell it if it loses them a lot of money.
On the other hand, you could
threat to us.
you could say that a U.S. bond is 4 basis points better than investing in a euro bond, and then if there's a genuine risk that a lawsuit will lead to the attachment of those assets, because if there is a lawsuit, I don't know whether the damages are only $1 billion, maybe they're $10 billion, maybe with punitives they're $750 billion. So I don't think they do it to punish us. I wonder whether it's a litigation strategy. Just some commentary. I mean, Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, so by definition, you don't have the right of the people to control the government. So you can't have free speech, because a lot of speakers would say that the people should control the government. And their human rights toward women, LGBT, and religious freedom is 0. And we accept that. I mean, a Mormon missionary in Riyadh is, I assume, a dead Mormon missionary or just an imprisoned Mormon missionary. I don't know which. But so I focus on, okay, we know that all about them. The question is, are they exporting terrorism? 2 ways that they can export terrorism. One is to finance the people that actually blow things up. Here's the money today, blow something up tomorrow. 9/11 support, of course, that is the focus of the 28 pages. But the other is to finance a propaganda education machine designed to teach millions of people that blowing things up is a good idea. The House of Saud and the Wahhabis have an alliance that goes back to the 1700s. I can't fault them if they finance efforts to say, hey, you should strictly follow Islam. Pray 5 times a day, don't slough off and do 4. But we're not talking about just orthodox practice. We're talking about, are they teaching people? How much money is Saudi Arabia spending out of government money or royal money to spread Wahhabi Islam? And are they able, is there a form of Wahhabi Islam they can spread that is orthodox but not violent?
The answer to your first question is it doesn't matter much how much they're spending, because it doesn't cost much. We found on the 9/11 Commission that the entire operation against the United States to pull off
oh yeah, if they were financing the people that blow things up, you do that for small amounts of money. But if your goal is to change popular opinion from Rabat to Jakarta, and to create millions of people who think that killing non-Muslims is a good idea, that can be expensive. And I know that others have talked about, did they finance this or that terrorist act? My focus is, are they financing a well-designed propaganda effort to create millions of pro-terrorist thinkers? We know, does anybody have an idea how much they're spending to finance Wahhabism? And can you draw a distinction between violent and nonviolent Wahhabism, or is there just one Wahhabism?
There are lots of Saudis who would argue that you can draw a distinction between violent and nonviolent Wahhabism. The late King Abdullah fired some of the senior religious scholars who, in essence, are the Supreme Court of what is the right Islam. King Salman has restored one of them. So there are a lot of people in Saudi Arabia who do not believe in killing other people. But I think your point is well taken, that it's more, in my view, it's less the direct financing than the indirect promotion of a form of religion that we obviously would regard as intolerant.
I would go beyond intolerant. I mean, those who are just
Intolerant
orthodox,
and
who say
violent.
bad things, who teach that if you have a, you're going to hell if you have a ham sandwich. That's a certain intolerance. It's when you start advocating blowing things up that I draw the line. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. To my good friend from California, according to a Senate Judiciary Committee testimony, Saudi Arabia spends $4 billion a year on mosques, madrasas, preachers, students, and textbooks to spread the Wahhabi creed, if that helps out at all. If I could turn to Mr. Henderson, do you think that the kingdom, the House of Saud, can survive without its affiliation to Wahhabism? Can it survive?
Could you just repeat the question?
Can the kingdom, can the House of Saud survive without its affiliation to Wahhabism?
It would be a very different kingdom. Historically, it is a partnership between the House of Saud and the religious leadership.
So is that a tepid yes? Is it? I mean, is that so? You're saying there's a chance? What is that?
I don't think it's a hypothetical which I've never thought of it before, and because I don't think it's within the range of realistic possibility.
Okay, so it's not realistic, because it seems to me, the House of Saud, the Saudis have said we are now an unreliable partner, so to speak, because we're not able to protect their monarchy. But I would say that they have been duplicitous and unreliable because they've spent $4 billion a year or something to that effect to spread Wahhabism around the globe, including North America, et cetera. I mean, I've got all the stats here of the thousands of mosques and centers and colleges, and 80% of the mosques, 1,200 mosques operating in the U.S. were constructed after 2001. Mostly with Saudi financing, and it just goes on and on from there, whether you go to Europe or wherever you go. That having been said, at some point, as an ally who we're engaged in this war on terrorism, whether we like it or not, because the war has come to our doorstep, is it too much to ask? I guess that's the question. Is it too much to ask for them to stop that, to stop it?
I think what you're describing is a very valid question. I did not recognize comments of your colleague, Mr. Sherman, in terms of defining what is journalistically known as Wahhabism as being necessarily violent. I think it is intolerant, and it is a conservative and strict Islam, which is...
I would rather you not use the term conservative as opposed to fundamentalist. Thank you very kindly.
Sorry, it's the Britishness in me, I'm sorry.
I appreciate that, but it means something here.
Forgive me.
Point of personal privilege, I'd prefer you go back to the original phraseology.
Reclaiming my time and then some, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. I think there is a concern amongst leaders of Muslim communities in other parts of the world that Saudi Arabia spends a lot of money bringing mosques and bringing teachers to their countries and introducing a stricter form of Islam.
But do they not make the connection that when they bring the mosques and the teachers and the teaching, they are bringing terrorism and an ideology of terrorism and death?
I don't think Wahhabism is an ideology, has an ideology of terrorism.
Okay, I appreciate your opinion. Ms. House, you talked about our relationship with the Saudis and Israel and how important it is to maintain that stability in the Middle East, but does that mean that the United States should accept the circumstances of what many Americans, myself included, see as Saudi Arabia's support, material support, through the construction of mosques and the ideology around the world, including their own neighborhood? Should we accept that for the stability, as you put it, in our relationship with Israel and Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think we ought to, and hopefully we do, continuously try to underscore to them that it's not in...
Ma'am, with all due respect, this has been going on for decades. At what point do we require action on their part? Talking is one thing, but there are terrorists running around the globe.
What kind of action can you require?
We can request that they no longer fund this, that they change the teaching, that they get in the game on this. Like, we have to be. Is that too much to ask? And is it worth the stability?
It's not too much to ask, but I don't know
that it will
result in a change.
Is it too much to demand for the sake of our relationship?
Well, what's the rest of the demand? If not, we are not going to protect our interest in the Persian Gulf anymore.
What about our interest in our schools and our neighborhoods here where people are going to blow us up? What about those interests? Are they not important? Because they're coming here. They're here now.
They are. Yeah.
So at what point, what's the tipping point, if you know?
I just think, I didn't get to talk about Iran. I think that you're focused on Saudi Arabia today for obvious reasons, but they are not the only people propagating terrorism in the Middle East.
Okay,
Iran
I agree with
too.
that, but for their part, let's just talk about their part in our relationship. Do we just continue to accept it without any... There's no benchmark. We don't see any milestones at all from my standpoint.
The witness can answer that question.
It's my personal view that the regime could do more. In history, when the old man was founding the country and the religious nuts, his Ikhwan, wanted to invade Iraq, and he knew that the British did not want him to and would cut off his money, he kept them from doing that. He in essence, waged a war on his own troops and won. When the royal family chooses to lay down a marker, I think they can. And so I believe that's why I'm intrigued with what the young guy is doing when he talks about, and I know talk is cheap, but talks about moderate Islam. The young people in Saudi Arabia these days are not just dependent on Saudi TV. You can now get 90 channels of TV. You can watch anything in Saudi Arabia, and they're all on the internet, and they all do have a much greater idea about what goes on in the rest of the world. So there is some change in the society, and I remind you again, 70% of people are under 30 years of age. It could be a quite different Saudi Arabia, not liberal like this country, but it could be a quite different place in 10 years if the society cut off from its ability to be passive and dependent on the government through spending oil to give everybody a job and buy their loyalty, which they can't afford anymore. If people become self-reliant, which they are urging them to do, we have to see if this transpires. It will be, I think, a somewhat different society.
I thank the witness. Mr. Rohrabacher from California.
Thank you very much. We were talking about words, a little back and forth on words. Let me just note, sometimes it is discouraging to hear people use certain words or the inability of certain people to use words at a time when radical Islamic terrorism threatens to murder tens of thousands, if not more, Americans. It is quite disconcerting that our own president can't use the term radical Islamic terrorism, and that needs to be looked at closely. In terms of the Saudis, I will have to suggest that, Ms. House, that I like your optimism, but there's a thing called irrational optimism. And that's when someone gets beaten in the head a number of times and think they can do the same exact thing without getting beat in the head. The Saudis have been financing terrorism now for 20 years at least. At least. I mean, they are, the Saudis were behind the Taliban. The Saudis financed Pakistan, and they still do. And the Taliban were financed by that money. Just, what, 2 days ago, there was a drone attack where we took out the new leader of the Taliban. And where was he? He was in Pakistan. And who do you think is paying his bills in Pakistan? The Pakistanis, they're broke. They get their money from Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis have been financing this mayhem. I mean, it's not just the fact that 15 of 19 of the terrorists that murdered 3,000 Americans on 9/11 that they were Saudis, but it's what the government has actually done. And let me ask, how many of you there believe that the royal family of Saudi Arabia did not know and was unaware that there was a terrorist plot being implemented that would result in an historic terrorist attack in the United States in the lead up to 9/11? Do you believe that the Saudi royal family did not know? Raise your hand if you think that. Oh, okay. Let me just suggest this, that, okay, we have 2 and 2, I think. So you guys believe that the Saudi royal family may well have known there was a major terrorist attack coming. Go right ahead.
Congressman, you and I go way back from our time together when I served up here. That is just too difficult of a question for somebody to raise their hand or put their hand down to.
Well, it's not for me. I'll raise my hand right here. And let me tell you something.
Have you read the 28 pages?
Within 4 months before 9/11, I was tipped off by a very high-ranking Taliban who happened to work with me in Afghanistan when we were fighting the Soviets, that there was going to be, there's a plot going on, and what do you think about this ongoing plot? And I might say the Warren Commission didn't seem to, when I sent that information over that I'd been tipped off, they did not follow through on it. I wonder why. And so what we have here is a high-level ranking member of the Taliban knows about this, but we don't think that the high-ranking people in the Saudi Arabia who are financing the whole thing didn't know about it. This is clear that the Saudis have been intentionally involved in the mass slaughter of Americans and other people in the world in a terrorist way. We know that they are, number one, we know that they are currently financing madrasa schools. And they teach, what do they teach these kids at school? When they come out of them, they can be radical Islamic terrorists, or they can't do anything else in the modern economy. They finance mosques that are preaching the worst kind of hatred, and we're hearing about this all the time in the Balkans, where they're financing the worst kind of, and we have, of course, the direct finance of terrorism. That we have seen directly into Saudi Arabia. Now, we're being told that by you today that we really don't know if the Saudi royal family is involved in this. Well, even if they are aware of this, they are responsible. After 9/11, they didn't want to kill 3,000 Americans on 9/11. They wanted to kill 50,000 Americans on 9/11. 50,000. That's what they thought. When those buildings were going to come down, they didn't know that we could get all the people out. They were there for a mass slaughter of Americans. And we have just managed to just sort of, well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, whether or not the royal family knew about this or not. I say that the Saudi royal family has made itself clear that they do not deserve the benefit of the doubt because of all of their actions they've been involved in. And whether or not the young Saudi royal family members that are watching TV now are going to have an epiphany that the Wahhabism isn't really, doesn't demand them to go out and attack the West. Whether or not that's going to happen or not, I don't think we can rely on that, especially when especially when you find that all of these young Islamic terrorists are springing up in different parts of the world, including in San Bernardino, including at the Boston Marathon. You have these people who have been exposed to Western society, but they've also been treated to a very high dose of Wahhabi radical Islamic philosophy that leads them to commit these terrorist acts. It's either we're going to face reality or there's going to be more and more of our people slaughtered. And I think this, how we deal with Saudi Arabia, it's either got to be realistic or our people are going to suffer the consequences. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentleman from California. Thank all of the witnesses for being here. I want to thank the guests in the gallery as well, and I also want to recognize some of the folks from the families of 9/11 that are here today as well. Thank you once again, and there may be other questions we have. You know the routine. We put them in writing, we send them to you, and we expect an answer in 10 days. Subcommittee is adjourned.